The other day, I was sitting in a quiet corner of a university library when I noticed a student intensely marking up a history textbook. He was huffing, shaking his head as he underlined a section on ancient Athens. When he saw me looking, he pointed to a passage describing the limitations of Greek democracy. "It's honestly overrated," he said. His voice carried a certain smug confidence. "Just a small-scale system for a few slave owners. Our textbooks have it right. It was exclusive, primitive, and basically irrelevant to the modern world." He looked incredibly satisfied with this dismissal, as if he had successfully dismantled an entire civilization with a single highlighter. But then the conversation took a sharp turn. I asked him if he'd ever participated in a direct vote on a national policy, or if he knew the names of the people who actually drafted the laws governing his taxes. His expression shifted instantly from arrogance to a kind of glazed-over silence. He started stuttering about representative systems and how the world is too big now, finally admitting that he felt he had absolutely no influence over the government. He complained that he felt like a cog in a machine, working a job he hated just to follow rules he never agreed to. That sudden reversal was jarring. One second, he was mocking the limited democracy of the Athenians from a position of perceived modern superiority. The next, he was describing a life of total political apathy and powerlessness. It made me realize that while our textbooks are quick to label Athens as just a small city-state of slave owners, they often miss the most radical part of the story. In Athens, if the people felt a politician was becoming too powerful or arrogant, they didn't just complain on social media. They took pieces of broken pottery, scratched the man's name on them, and physically kicked him out of the city for 10 years. They didn't trust human nature. They trusted a system designed to cage power. When you compare that level of raw, direct agency to our modern reality, where rights are written beautifully on paper but rarely felt in practice, you have to wonder, who is actually more free? Is the Athenian model truly a primitive relic, or does it hold a secret about power that we've been conditioned to forget? So, okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, that's a really powerful story. It gets right to the heart of the matter.
It does. And we've been given this stack of sources that takes that spark of modern political frustration.
Exactly.
And it transports us back 2.5 millennia. But it also compares it to models of governance all around the world today.
Right. It's not just a history lesson. This is about now.
This deep dive is really about understanding power, who holds it, how it's checked, and whether the systems we call modern are really better than these relics we're taught to just dismiss.
And our source material has a pretty strong take on this. It suggests the Athenian system wasn't just some political oddity. It calls it a shackled Leviathan.
A shackled Leviathan. I like that phrase. A state that was both powerful and controlled by a strong society.
Precisely. Mm-hmm. And we're going to compare that model to the reality of weak states today. Look at how ancient tools like ostracism were designed to, cage power.
And then dive into this huge cultural gulf between, say, individualistic Western philosophy and the more collective focus of the East.
Yeah. The mission, really, is to get at the geometry of agency. Why do some systems, even with all their flaws, make people feel powerful?
And why do others, with all their promises, just breed that feeling the student had, total apathy?
It's a crucial mission.
Yeah.
We're not treating these ancient institutions like museum pieces. We're using them as functional comparative models for state efficiency and social control.
Right.
The core idea, which speaks directly to that student's feeling of powerlessness, is that real power, the kind that delivers public goods, provides services, resolves conflict, it doesn't come from a state with an uncontested monopoly.
Okay, so where does it come from?
It comes from a state where society is constantly in a race against the state's power.
A constant race. That's the key to this shackled Leviathan idea, isn't it?
It is. The sources basically position this as the ideal governance sweet spot. Athens had it. Later, Britain had it. It's a government strong enough to get big things done.
But not so strong that people feel steamrolled. They're accountable.
Exactly. This continuous contest between the state and society. Some people call it the Red Queen effect. In politics, it means both sides are always investing in their own capabilities to keep up with the other.
So the state builds up its infrastructure, its military.
And society builds up its institutional checks, its ability to mobilize. And the result is that both the state and the society get stronger and more capable.
Let's start there then. Let's define this Athenian anomaly. How on earth did a small city-state develop such high capacity alongside such a strong, politically active society?
Well, the path to the shackled Leviathan was paved with deep, violent conflict.
It wasn't just handed down by some enlightened philosopher.
Not at all. It was forged in the fire of elite mass struggle. The sources trace the beginning of these inclusive institutions all the way back to Solon's reforms in 594 BC, and those were specifically designed to diffuse this massive tension between the aristocrats and, the common people.
So the reforms were less about some abstract idea of rights and more about pure survival, just trying to stop a civil war.
Precisely. Solon knew the biggest source of instability was economic exploitation and legal vulnerability. His reforms were a direct hit on those problems. They fundamentally guaranteed personal freedom and property rights.
The big one everyone remembers is him ending debt peonage, right?
Most famously, yes. He eliminated debt peonage and made it illegal to enslave another Athenian citizen for debt. Just think about how radical that was.
It's huge.
It meant that even the poorest citizen had this guarantee floor of material independence. You couldn't be completely wiped out. And that's the necessary starting point for any kind of political participation.
And he didn't just stop at the economy. The sources say he also tackled the legal system, making it accessible to the masses. Land reform and judicial reforms are mentioned as pillars.
Solon shifted the balance of power by giving ordinary Athenians access to the courts. It meant they could actually seek justice against powerful people. But the most insightful part, the bit that really speaks to that student's complaint about elite arrogance, is the hubris law.
Tell me more about that. It sounds less like a legal reform and more like a massive social engineering project.
And it was. The hubris law made behavior aimed at humiliation, intimidation, or intentional abuse illegal.
Against anyone.
Against any resident of Athens, even resident aliens and slaves. This wasn't about property. This was about defining public dignity and reining in elite contempt.
Because before that, aristocratic power was basically enforced through public humiliation. The rich could do whatever they wanted to the poor and get away with it.
They could. Performative cruelty and disdain were part of the system. So by outlawing hubris, that toxic mix of arrogance and violence, Solon sent a clear signal.
The signal being that before the law, powerful officials were now the equals of ordinary citizens. This feels like the first real step toward making equality before the law a social reality, not just a nice idea.
It absolutely was. It seriously curtailed the coercive power of the elite. It forced them to treat non-elites with a baseline of respect, which in turn builds trust in institutions and the state's ability to enforce common rules.
Okay, and we can't talk about a power shift like this without looking at the military and economic foundations. The sources make a really strong case for the role of technology here, specifically the Iron Age.
This is the variable that so often gets overlooked in political history. The move from bronze to iron had this profoundly democratizing effect.
How so?
Well, bronze weapons were scarce, they were expensive, and they were easily monopolized by the aristocratic cavalry.
The rich guys on horses.
Exactly. But iron ore was cheap, and it was everywhere. As the archaeologist Gordon Childe famously put it, cheap iron democratized agriculture and industry and warfare too.
So if every citizen can afford a basic set of iron weapons and armor, the power shifts from the handful of rich men who can afford horses and bronze
to the massive phalanx of citizen infantry, the hoplites. Military power now rests with the common citizenry. The state, meaning the wealthy elites who traditionally ran it, can't just coerce the masses anymore. Not when they're facing a well-armed, mobilized, and now legally protected population.
These armed citizens became the new political muscle, and they started demanding that the political structure reflect their military importance.
Which brings us to Kleisthenes, who basically codified this new reality in 508 BC. If Solon set the economic and legal rules, Kleisthenes built the institutions to make sure those rules were enforced by the many, not the few.
And his reforms, also born from conflict, were designed to institutionalize that discipline on the elites, to break the power of those old aristocratic family networks.
And his most radical innovation was the Council of 500, the Bull.
500 men, chosen by lottery from all 10 of the new tribes. That mechanism, sortition, that's really the genius of it all, isn't it?
It's the ultimate check against a permanent political class forming. Every man over 30 was eligible, and the selection was random.
So a potter, a farmer, a merchant, they could all end up holding immense executive power for 1 year.
For a single, non-renewable year. And since almost every citizen would eventually serve, it just dismantled the possibility of political power clustering around certain families or dynasties.
But the Bull was more than just some random committee. It was the executive engine of Athens. It decided what the main assembly of all citizens, the ecclesia, could even talk about.
It was the administrative and executive core. Its job was to prepare all the preliminary decrees, the probuldamata, that the ecclesia would then debate and vote on. They managed the finances, they oversaw public officials, handled foreign affairs, directed the fleet.
So by controlling the agenda, the council stopped charismatic leaders from just whipping up the assembly's passions on some dangerous, unprepared motion. It was a daily rotating check on executive power.
It was. And if those daily checks failed, if some elite figure managed to bypass the council and become too dominant, too hubristic.
Then we get back to the final safeguard, ostracism.
Ostracism was, you could argue, the most innovative and powerful institutional device they had for making sure their inclusive institution survived. It was explicitly designed to discipline elites who threatened to become too powerful or to destabilize the state.
Let's walk through the mechanics again, because they're so important for understanding how it actually worked.
It was a two-stage process. First, the assembly would vote once a year on whether to even hold an ostracism.
Just a yes or no.
Right. If they said yes, then 2 months later, the citizens would gather in the marketplace, the agora, and cast their votes, their broken pieces of pottery, the ostraca.
And if a quorum of 6,000 votes was cast against a single person,
that individual was banished for 10 years.
Now, here's where I have to push back a little, based on what the sources say. We often hear this described as non-punitive, like a kind of preventative risk management. But the sources also mention it was used to settle conflicts over radically opposed policies, like the banishment of Themistocles or Thucydides, son of Milesius, who is against Pericles' big building program. Isn't this just a fancy way of saying the mob voted out the guy who lost the policy debate? Is it really non-punitive, or is it just policy enforcement in disguise?
That's a really sharp observation, and it gets right to the heart of how the Athenians thought about power. Yes, it was used to resolve policy conflicts, but in the Athenian political world, radical policy opposition was seen as inherently destabilizing. It was borderline a threat to the state itself.
Okay.
The sources stressed that the mechanism's power was in its non-judicial nature. There was no charge of corruption or treason. No defense was allowed.
And the exile was mandatory but temporary. Their property wasn't taken, and they could come back without any stigma.
Exactly. So if Themistocles was pushing for naval expansion and another faction wanted to focus on land defense, the assembly could basically decide, okay, we're going with the navy. And therefore, Themistocles' opponent has to leave before his opposition destabilizes everything.
So it is policy enforcement, but it's done through, political surgery, not legal execution?
A great way to put it. It was diffuse power, the whole collective polity exercised it, and it was automatic. A safety valve to reduce tension. And the proof is in the numbers. Only about 15 people were actually ostracized over 180 years.
Which shows the mere threat of it was the real function.
Precisely. It kept the ambitious, the hubristic elites in line. It was a constant reminder that their power was conditional on the collective will of the people, who held the final, arbitrary, and ultimate agency.
This is the shackled Leviathan in action. The state is powerful, but society holds the cage. So Athens figured out this difficult balance of checking power while keeping state capacity. But let's jump forward 2 millennia and look at most of the world today. The weak state or the absent Leviathan. It's such a stark contrast.
It is.
The simple economic assumption that less state interference means fewer economic distortions. It just completely falls apart when the state is functionally absent.
It absolutely does. The sources emphasize this over and over. Weak states are consistently associated with the worst economic outcomes. And why? Because the state can't perform its most basic functions. It can't protect contracts, enforce order, collect taxes to fund public goods, or build essential infrastructure.
Yeah. There's a quote from Joel Migdal's work that's pretty striking. He talks about the widespread inability of leaders in the developing world to establish predominance even across their own territory.
To understand this absence, we have to define what makes a state present and capable. We looked at Max Weber's 4 pillars of state capacity. We should break those down and see where the weakness comes from.
Okay, let's do it.
The first and most famous pillar is the monopoly of legitimate violence. This means the state has to be the only actor legally allowed to use force. It enforces law and order and eliminates competitors like militias or organized crime.
Now, wait a second. If we look back at Athens, didn't they essentially fare that test? The citizens, the hoplites, were armed, they mobilized themselves, they directly executed power through the assembly. Doesn't the very idea of a shackled Leviathan contradict that Weberian idea of a state monopoly of violence?
That's an excellent challenge. It really shows the limits of applying modern definitions backwards in time. Athens did maintain a monopoly of legitimate violence through state institutions, the police, the courts, military command, but they made sure that the coercive capacity was always diffuse.
Okay.
It was ultimately controlled by the armed citizenry. The crucial difference is that the use of violence, whether it was the Navy or a judicial execution, was legitimized and overseen by inclusive institutions like the bull and the ecclesia.
Whereas in a weak modern state, the violence is often illegitimate and uncontrolled, wielded by all these competing groups.
Exactly.
Fair enough. Okay, so moving to the second pillar, the ability to tax and regulate economic activity. That feels like the ultimate barometer of a state's reach.
It really is. Tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is a very robust indicator of capacity. If a state can't effectively assess and collect taxes, it can't fund the public services that are necessary for development.
And the third pillar is infrastructural power or capacity, the actual physical presence of functionaries and bureaucracy across the territory.
And this is the one that really hits home for the ordinary citizen. You're talking about basic local presence.
Yeah.
When you think about state absences, just imagine trying to deal with a local government where there is literally no one there. No one to process a permit, to register a birth, or to enforce a simple law.
There's that historical snapshot of Colombia in 1912 that the sources mention.
It's so striking. The documentarian Rufino Gutierrez found that huge numbers of municipalities lacked a city council, a mayor, a judge, or even a tax collector.
Yeah.
The state was just absent. And that leaves communities completely vulnerable to predators or just internal collapse.
It makes you appreciate the mundane power of a well-staffed local DMV or courthouse. And the final pillar, which is often impossible in corrupt states, is the rational autonomous bureaucracy.
This is the ability of state institutions to operate with some independence from politically powerful groups. In a strong state, the tax collector enforces the rules for the president's cousin just as hard as they do for the ordinary farmer.
The bureaucracy serves the state's mission, not the private interests of some kleptocratic elite.
Right. Without that autonomy, any attempt to increase state capacity just increases the capacity of elites to extract rents, which is why the institutions are so critical.
And we have some really compelling empirical evidence showing that a history of centralized governance translates directly into bone capacity today.
The African case studies are very illuminating here. Researchers found that within Africa, countries and even specific ethnic groups that had a history of pre-colonial centralized tribal institutions.
So a history of being organized.
Yes, they're associated with significantly higher provision of public goods and greater wealth today. That historical capacity, the ability to govern at scale, it persists.
Let's use the Uganda data to make this more concrete for everyone listening.
The comparison between the centralized versus the fragmented regions of Uganda in 2002 is just a stark visual example. The central and western regions, which had established pre-colonial centralization, showed massive advantages over the fragmented northern regions.
What were the practical differences in day-to-day life?
Okay, look at infrastructure. The percentage of paved roads in the central region was 13.37%.
Not amazing, but...
But then, in the fragmented north, it was a staggering low of 1.33%.
Wow, 1%. That's basically nothing.
It tells you everything. Paved roads represent state investment, planning, long-term power. That 1.33% tells you the government's priorities simply do not reach those citizens.
And the human cost is visible in the public health data.
It is. Infant mortality in the central region was 71.9 per 1,000 live births. In the fragmented north, it jumped to 105.9.
That's a huge difference.
Huge. And only 5% of northern households had piped water, compared to 10-15% in the centralized regions. Massive disparities in sanitation, basic public health. Historical institutional capacity is a massive predictor of a state's current ability to deliver life-saving public goods.
But how do we avoid just attributing this to geography or, modern political favoritism? How can we rigorously trace the historical roots of that capacity?
Researchers use historical variables that are indicators of past state interest, but don't have direct relevance to current economics. They act as instruments.
Like what?
Like colonial state presence.
Sure.
It was heavily concentrated around key cities, gold mining regions, or areas with high native populations for control and taxation. Now, even if the gold mines closed, the infrastructure created for colonial administration, the roads, the buildings, the administrative memory, that became the skeleton for current state capacity.
And the reference to royal roads serves a similar historical function, right?
Exactly. These were roads built by colonial powers in difficult geographies, mainly for porters, showing where the state spent effort to reach and control territory.
And crucially, many of those roads were later abandoned as transport infrastructure.
Right. So since they no longer dictate current optimal trade routes, their presence now just acts as a historical marker of where the state once invested in reach. And the strong correlation between these past indicators and present state capacity shows that institutional effectiveness, once you establish it, is remarkably sticky, even if the state's goals change completely.
So we know weak states breed apathy and deliver terrible outcomes, yet they persist. They're so stubborn. This moves us from describing the problem to understanding why it's maintained, sometimes intentionally. We need theories of state formation, and the traditional answer is always conflict.
Charles Tilly gave us the famous line, "War made the state and the state made war." The idea is simple. External threats force you to centralize, to tax, to mobilize, all the building blocks of state capacity.
And Jeffrey Herbst applied this to Africa, suggesting that geographical barriers and low population density discouraged the kind of large-scale interstate warfare needed to force centralization, which contributed to weak states.
Right. But if we look at the internal motivations, the incentives for the elites, we turn to Olsen's concept of the stationary bandit.
The stationary bandit, let's break that down.
Olsen's theory is that the state starts as a form of organized banditry looking for long-term stability. A roving bandit just extracts the maximum rent immediately. They have a short time horizon, they loot, and they move on.
But a stationary bandit realizes they can get more wealth long-term by becoming like a state. They secure the territory, they encourage production, and they take moderate, predictable taxes.
It's a compelling metaphor. The optimal self-interest of the bandit aligns with creating a state. It needs stability to be able to tax effectively.
And we saw this play out empirically in eastern Congo after the price of coltan spiked.
We did. Coltan is much harder to conceal than gold. So when the price shot up, the incentive for armed groups to stabilize territory to become stationary bandits instead of predictable tax base, it increased dramatically.
And that spike correlated directly with an increase in territorial conquest by armed groups in the coltan-producing areas. It shows that stable extraction can, in fact, drive centralization.
Yes, but the sources also critique this pretty heavily, noting that the theory kind of falls apart when you look at historical reality.
It fails because it basically equates the state with organized banditry, which is too narrow, and it misses the political component.
Empirically, yes. Long-lived dictators, think of Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire or Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, they were often the most viciously kleptocratic, not the most developmental. If a long time horizon always leads to development, why do these strongmen prioritize massive personal extraction over public investment?
Because they prioritize staying in power. And staying in power often means actively maintaining state weakness. So we're moving from structural causes to deliberate strategic weakness engineered by elites.
Exactly. And we see two main ways this happens. The first is elite fear, especially the fear of institutional change. The Sierra Leone example is very illustrative.
Right. Elites might consciously keep the military weak, which prevents the central state from having a monopoly of violence and allows civil wars or instability to just fester in the outer regions.
But why would a sitting government want chaos?
Because increasing the military's capacity to end the conflict would unleash political instability. It would require real power sharing, constitutional reforms, democratic concessions, things the incumbent elites are not willing to make.
So they prefer the certainty of grabbing smaller, continuous rents from a weak, unstable state.
And risking everything on a stronger, centralized state that might force them to be disciplined. It's a cynical calculation. Controlled chaos is politically safer than risking real institutional change.
If elites are actively maintaining chaos to grab rents, how does a democratic citizen in that system ever hope to gain political agency? They're fighting a state that actively wants to be weak.
They're completely blocked. And this weakness is often maintained through the second mechanism. This symbiotic relationship between the central state and non-state armed actors. The case of Colombia and the right-wing AUC paramilitaries is a textbook example of this anti-Leviathan geometry.
We tend to think of non-state actors as competitors to the government. But in this case, the paramilitaries became political partners with the executive.
The symbiosis was highly functional, especially within the electoral system. The paramilitaries, through coercion or control, could deliver huge blocks of votes to the incumbent executive, especially in rural areas where the executive would normally do poorly.
And in return, the paramilitaries made sure legislators who were favorable to the executive got elected. They basically functioned as a coercive electoral machine.
So what was the payoff the executive gave to these armed groups?
Favorable policy. The executive delivered legislation that the paramilitaries wanted, most notably the very lenient justice and peace law.
What did that do?
It was engineered to limit the prison time for former paramilitaries and had clauses to stop them from being charged with sedition. Instead of reconquering the territory and establishing law and order, the state essentially negotiated with armed actors to maintain control through them.
And public services in those regions were, of course, totally neglected.
Completely. The depth of this corruption is just stunning. The sources mention the arrest of 62 members of Congress and the Senate for paramilitary links, including the president's own cousin, Mario Urde. That is a systemic failure of state capacity.
And the evidence is robust. Regression analysis confirms that after the AUC got into politics around 2001, paramilitary presence in a municipality correlated strongly with increased vote shares for third parties linked to them.
And significantly with the vote share of President Uribe in both the 2002 and 2006 elections, these paramilitaries persisted most effectively where they could provide that decisive electoral leverage for the incumbent. The system was structured to use weakness, the lack of a monopoly on violence, as a tool for political control and rent extraction.
Which leaves the ordinary citizen with no voice. Just a choice between two different flavors of extortion. We've looked at the ancient institutional checks and the modern strategic failures. Now we need to shift to the deeper philosophical divide that shapes how effective institutions can even be, the East-West cultural gulf, what the sources call the geography of thinking. This goes beyond just procedures and gets into how we fundamentally see the individual's place in society.
This cultural context is the bedrock. The Western tradition, which comes from the Enlightenment and Hellenic philosophy, places this paramount importance on individual freedom, rational thought, and a system of legal freedom.
This is embodied by what the sources call perfect legal norms that are designed to protect individual autonomy. It's Hayek's view of what a liberal society needs.
Right. And the philosophical lineage of freedom is interesting. It evolves from the Greek idea that freedom only belonged to the wise and the rational, to later thinkers like Hegel, who argued that historical progress itself is just the evolution in the consciousness of freedom across the entire population.
So this Western model champions political freedom, like democratic rights and material independence, the right to private property and wealth. These are seen as necessary checks on state power.
But the sources highlight a critical trade-off. This fierce prioritization of the individual often risks the loss of spiritual common ground, of deep social ties. It can lead to selfishness, hyper-individualism, which can make collective action really difficult.
And in stark contrast to that is the East, where the influence of Confucian collectivism dictates a fundamentally different geometry of control. Here, the basic unit isn't the individual citizen, it's the family.
Exactly. Confucian societies prioritize hierarchy, duties, social order, and self-control. The whole system relies on the loyal, reciprocal obedience of inferiors to superiors and the strict carrying out of defined social roles.
So the priority shifts from political and legal freedom to social freedom and spiritual or moral freedom.
Yes. The individual's interest is often intentionally suppressed for the sake of the collective. The emphasis is on harmony and continuity. It's fundamentally a collective survival strategy that prioritizes the continuity of the civilization over just unrestrained individual rights.
How does this actually manifest in governance? We're talking about moving from a Western rule-based governance to an Eastern relation-based governance.
Rule-based governance is what we know. It relies on formal written contracts, legal courts, standardized procedures. It treats everyone as an equal legal abstraction.
Okay.
Relation-based governance, which is characteristic of Confucian industrializing states, relies heavily on personal ties, informal agreements, and private network-based dispute resolution.
Can you give us an example of how that dispute resolution works?
Well, in a relation-based system, if a contract is broken, the main way you enforce it isn't immediate litigation. It's social pressure.
Reputation is key.
Reputation is everything. Dispute resolution might involve family elders, network heads, or trusted figures applying pressure, threatening social ostracization or the loss of future business within that network. The effectiveness relies on maintaining the moral and social integrity of the group, which holds far more power than some distant, abstract court.
And this cultural preference created a very specific type of successful economic structure.
It fosters these network economies. You see it in the keiretsu in Japan, the kiebels in South Korea, the patrilineal networks in Taiwan. These economies are rooted in strong, established social ties. The key actor is the network, not the lone entrepreneur.
And this cultural discipline was instrumental in rapid industrialization.
Absolutely. South Korean authoritarian leaders, for instance, successfully mobilized their labor force using Confucian rhetoric. They referred to workers as industrial soldiers to achieve this rapid, focused economic growth. They prioritized industrial output and physical metrics as the primary evidence of civilizational strength and institutional effectiveness.
It's a compelling argument that deep cultural values dictate which governance models are even feasible. But if the Western model of equality before the law is so philosophically distinct, why did we see Eastern states like Japan adopt aspects of it during their modernization?
This is a classic case of defensive modernization. Equality before the law wasn't always adopted because of some philosophical conviction. It was adopted out of pragmatic necessity.
Specifically, the need to increase societal effort and maximize returns to effort to counter a huge external threat.
Exactly. The Meiji Restoration in Japan in 1866 is the flagship example of this.
The Meiji elite recognized the existential threat posed by the West Commodore Perry's arrival, seeing China's defeat in the Opium Wars.
Their goal was unified military modernization under the slogan Fukoku Kihei, enrich the country, strengthen the army. And they realized they couldn't achieve this while maintaining a rigid, highly stratified feudal system.
So they had to dismantle some of the elite privileges just to unify the nation for the fight.
Precisely. This meant the partial abolition of the elite samurai privileges, disarming the warrior class, lifting the ban on intermarriage, and creating a professional army drawn from all classes. The introduction of some legal equality was a strategic move to overcome these deep, divisive elite privileges and create a single, cohesive, nationalist Japanese state that could field a modern army.
And we saw similar movements in 19th century Prussia, which modernized in response to Napoleon, and the Ottoman Empire's Tanzimat reforms, which introduced legal equality for non-Muslim minorities.
It was military necessity driving legal change, not some abstract moral imperative.
It was pure state capacity building. They needed a larger, unified base of citizens willing to fight and produce, and they had to provide minimal guarantees of rights and equality before the law to incentivize that effort.
This brings us right back to the student's complaint in the library.
No.
He felt like a cog in a machine. This whole discussion really pivots on where that line falls between individual agency and the collective good in these massive modern systems.
The modern tension is so acute. The social commentary we reviewed highlights this critique that modern, oversized society forces a kind of stifling conformity.
Right.
It suppresses what some individualists might call natural or animalistic needs, the desire for pleasure, excitement, ecstasy, in favor of predictable comfort, safety, and ultimately a state of calculated mediocrity. The feeling of being a cog is the price of scale.
And this critique draws on radical individualists like Emma Goldman, who saw the majority itself as the annihilator of individuality.
Goldman fundamentally challenged the utilitarian ideal. She argued that the mass, the majority, is the enemy of progress and the suppressor of the human spirit. For her, true progress comes from the minority that refuses to be tamed by the average or the safety dictated by the mass.
And her position is that the concept between the individual and society is made worse by the sheer overwhelming neoliberal scale of modern governance. If the system is too big and unresponsive, why should the individual sacrifice their personal truth for it?
This leads us to the utilitarian dilemma. Those really difficult, visceral scenarios where individual self-interest directly conflicts with the collective good. The example of sanitation is grim, but it's illustrative.
It is. Take the conflict over homelessness and sanitation. A homeless individual prioritizing their immediate survival might use public waterways for sanitation, acting purely in self-interest.
But that action immediately creates a public health risk for the whole community.
And the community, in turn, prioritizes public health, the collective well-being, which often involves policies that dramatically harm the individual in need.
There's no easy answer because there's no system that perfectly reconciles individual survival with collective safety.
The sources make it clear that in these scenarios, there is no objectively superior moral solution. It just comes down to where your interests lie and whether you're willing to accept the necessary sacrifice for a large, imperfect system.
And that student's frustration, that sense of powerlessness, is the product of living in a system of enormous scale where the mechanism for individual agency, whether it's voting or direct action, feels hopelessly diffuse.
Unlike the physical act of scratching a name on a shard of pottery 2,500 years ago, what this deep dive reveals is that the quality of governance is not measured by the quantity of legal rights on paper, nor by the simple absence of the state, which only invites the roving bandit. It is defined by the three concepts we've discussed: institutional design, state effectiveness, and underlying cultural values. The strong society model of Athens, the shackled Leviathan, mandated the collective caging of elite power through explicit institutional mechanisms like the ostracon. In contrast, many modern states suffer because elites actively maintain chaos or prevent bureaucratic autonomy to secure rents, leaving citizens with an absent Leviathan. Ultimately, whether in ancient Athens or a modern nation, true power and agency emerge from the successful institutionalized negotiation and sustained contest between the power of the state and the sustained strength of society. It is the balance, the successful caging of power, that determines the actual freedom and influence felt by the individual.